Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, San Francisco's premier author interview program. Joining us today is an author, a man who used to own a bookstore, and he's also a man who knows something about old books and their values. His name is John Dunning. His book is called The Bookman's Promise, the long-awaited, as they say, new Cliff Janeway novel. Is published by Scribner's. Welcome, John. Thank you for coming with us.
Well, thank you.
I wanted to start this interview with something that brings great pleasure to those of us in the radio business. The book starts. The man said, "Welcome to Book Beat, Mr. Janeway," and this was how it began. We were sitting in a Boston studio before the entire invisible listening audience of, I'm sorry to have to say this, National Public Radio. I was here against my better judgment. That's the way the book starts. That's pretty nice for us in radio.
Well, thank you.
The other thing that I wanted to bring to your attention is the review in Kirkus, which is kind of nice. It calls the book endlessly inventive, exhilarating, and literate. Quite a knockout punch for a used bookseller. Now, the used bookseller is not the right term here, is it? I mean, you are possibly, the terms that come up in the book are Bookman, Book Scout, Antiquarian. Now, what are we talking about here? Three different people?
Yeah, in a way. I did have a used bookstore. Mm-hmm. I always think of that Isaac Dennison line. I had a farm in Africa. I had a bookstore in Denver. And it was out on East Colfax, just about where Janeway's is, on
Correct.
East Colfax in Jersey.
Right.
But I was also a book scout.
What's a book scout?
I hunted books, and I still am.
Okay. Now, a book scout is somebody who would perhaps work for a bookman? In
Not
the sense
necessarily.
That no? Okay.
No, you just go and look for stuff wherever you can find it.
Okay. And then the other term that, kind of comes up in this business is antiquarian. What does that mean? Is that different from the bookman and the book scout?
That means you're a very old bookman. And I think that's me. An antiquarian bookman is somebody who deals primarily in much older books.
Okay.
Books without jackets that go back to the last century, or century, actually, the 19th century or beyond. As opposed to what they call hypermoderns today.
Hypermoderns?
You hadn't heard that term.
No, I hadn't.
You're a purist. A hypermodern is a book that becomes collectible almost as soon as it's published.
By St. Martin's Press?
St. Martin's Press is one of them, yeah.
Okay.
They did small print runs on some of their books, and the authors became almost immediately sought after by book hunters and book scouts and dealers all over the country.
I'll be a son of a gun. Well, the Bookman's Promise takes us wonderfully into the old and not so old rare book world and gives us a view of a fascinating place full of money and passion, and in the case of your book, murder. Mm-hmm. And it begins with Cliff Janeway buying a signed first edition of Richard Burton's Pilgrimage to Medina and Mecca for $29,000 and change, a price of which he is quite proud. And then what happens?
And then suddenly an old woman appears in his store and claims that the books belong to her grandfather, a very old woman, and that they were meant to be part of her legacy. And her story is so frighteningly real to Janeway that he begins to believe it.
The other thing that was nice about her is that she was not one of the creeps that come out of the woodwork when you have a moment or two of celebrity.
Yeah. Janeway actually just has his brief 15 minutes in the sun, as Andy Warhol, I guess, said.
And then he tries to crawl back in, and some terrible things start to happen. He gets to meet a Pulitzer Prize winner who, in my opinion, is the saddest, unhappiest Pulitzer Prize winner I've ever heard about.
Yeah, he's a guy who has writer's block all of a sudden, can't write. He's a stuffed shirt But he is also, I hope, an understandable character in the publishing trade where, you know, he has been aware of this enormous talent he has for a long time and couldn't get published decently. I've known writers like that, who couldn't get published. Michael Sharrow was one of those. I mean, he wasn't like Archer, but he was this great talent whose book, The Killer Angels, eventually won a Pulitzer Prize, but got rejected, and finally David McKay, A Little Tiny House, published it, and now it's a classic.
Okay, there's a section of Bookman's Promise where research and storyline mesh perfectly. I want to talk about that when we come back.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
This is Conversations on the Coast. I'm Jim Foster. Our guest today is John Dunning, award-winning author of a book called Book to Die. Today he's talking about The Bookman's Promise, the new Cliff Janeway novel. And there's a magazine called Firsts, the Book Collector's Magazine, which says The Bookman's Promise, the highly anticipated third entry in John Dunning's Cliff Janeway Biblio-Mystery series, is far and away the best integrated and most entertaining. And one of the things that I think you do a wonderful job of integrating is an entire section of the book that is, it's about 50 pages long, and it's called Burton and Charlie.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to ask the question, where does this come from? Does this come from your imagination? Is this part of the Burton's writings?
There are no real clues as to what Burton was doing during those 2 months and 3 months, whatever it was, and I pretty much had my way with him. It is a novel, and so I imagine what he might be doing.
Well, the thing that I like about it is that your writing, your diction changes from, 1987, if you will, back to the 19th century, and it's very smooth, and it seems, the way it should be.
Well, thank you. It is difficult to do that because they did talk and write differently back then.
They sure did. There was a lot of circumlocutions and things like that. There were phrases that I guess you could say sprang out of what was seen to be politeness in those days.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really very, very nice. It starts, I had admired Burton from afar. I mean, you never say that today, but I never trusted Floyd, who was the Secretary of War. Yes, I worked for him, but I had always considered him a rogue. In the daily job, my opinion didn't matter much, for I did my job diligently, and our paths seldom crossed. And he'd always put Floyd in a traitorous light, a man who used his position to transfer tons of arms and materiel to the South, then fled to join the Confederacy when the war finally began. In the department, I kept my distance. Now, that's Charles Warren.
Mm-hmm.
And Charles, is he totally imaginary, too?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Josephine Gallant, who is his granddaughter.
Right.
All of these people are imaginary, all but Burton.
All but Burton. Wow. I mean, you weave them together in such a way. I was buying reality here.
Good.
Congratulations.
That's what you're supposed to do as a writer, I mean, if you tell me that and if you believe that, then the book has worked for you.
It certainly has. It certainly has. Now, the other thing that's stunning, I think, is how you can, come from that kind of writing, if you will. That's not a very elegant expression, to a very different way to write when Janeway is kind of contemplating, if you will, whether he still has the guts to kill somebody. And you're right, I was first amazed by the detachment I felt and then by its slow reversal. It was if only now had I begun to see the consequences, not for Dante, but for me. To get this far, to be sitting here looking at that phone, I must have stepped naively indeed through the first half of my life and never thought about what such acts make of the men who do them. The first half of his life being a cop. I had spent a lifetime on the right side of the law. Could I really be thinking now of becoming a cold-blooded killer? And a little later on, you used the phrase that being a cop was part of my heartbeat. And that's a very different kind of writing, but equally effective.
You know, it's just a step from my own heartbeat, which is being a writer and being a bookman. I've been very lucky in life in that I've found two careers that have been both very satisfying. Not easy, but nothing that's that satisfying is easy, you know?
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
I also like working in radio, too.
I know you're a broadcaster. Or you were, yeah. No more?
No, I ran afoul of station brass. I know you find this just really difficult to believe.
Yes, absolutely. There's no problems like that here in San Francisco.
And they wanted me to cut my commercials out of my, you know, I used to broadcast old-time radio, and I would broadcast it in its entirety with no breaks, and I ran into some problems with that, and I just thought it was easier to quit.
Well, thank goodness our friend our friend does not quit. Janeway works on discovering things about the book written by Burton. He discovers things about murders, both real and potential, and it turns into an amazing combination of insight into a wonderful world and also the very hot world of murder and mayhem.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.